The power to destroy millions didn't begin with a missile launch or a declaration of war. It began quietly, behind closed doors, hidden in paperwork, sealed in signatures that would never be seen by the public. Orders were written, names were listed, and somewhere deep inside a system built on fear, entire lives were erased before the world even knew they existed. At the height of the 20th century, while nations prepared for open conflict, another kind of power was already at work. Silent, absolute, and far more unpredictable. A system where loyalty meant survival and suspicion meant disappearance. There were no battlefields here, no warning sirens, just a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and the understanding that it might be the last sound you would ever hear. This was the reality behind one of the most feared figures of the Cold War era, Joseph Stalin. To the outside world, he was the leader of a rising superpower, the man who helped defeat Nazi Germany, a symbol of strength at a time when global balance depended on it. But behind that image existed something far more complex and far more dangerous. As World War II came to an end, a new kind of conflict began to take shape. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly dissolved into suspicion. Two systems, two ideologies, two visions of the future. Each convinced the other posed an existential threat. What followed wasn't traditional war, but a constant state of tension where every decision carried global consequences. For the United States, understanding the Soviet Union became a matter of survival. But that wasn't easy. The country was closed off, controlled, and carefully managed. Information didn't flow freely. It was contained, filtered, and often manipulated. What appeared strong on the surface often concealed deep internal instability. And at the center of it all was a system built not just on power, but on control. Inside the Soviet Union, authority didn't rely solely on military strength or political influence. It relied on something far more effective: fear. A network of surveillance, informants, and secret police ensured that no one was ever truly safe from suspicion. Loyalty wasn't enough. You had to prove it constantly. And even then, it might not be enough to save you. Millions were caught in this system. Soldiers, workers, intellectuals, even members of the Communist Party itself. Entire groups were labeled as threats, not because of what they had done, but because of what they might do. The line between citizen and enemy became almost impossible to see, and that uncertainty was exactly the point. For American intelligence analysts, this created a dangerous problem. How do you predict the actions of a government driven not just by strategy, but by paranoia? How do you negotiate with a leader whose decisions were shaped as much by internal fear as by external pressure? The challenge wasn't just military, it was psychological. The United States wasn't facing conventional adversary. It was facing a system where unpredictability was built into its foundation. But understanding that system would become one of the most important strategic advantages of the Cold War, because behind the secrecy, behind the propaganda, and behind the image of absolute control, there were cracks. And once those cracks were understood, they revealed something critical. Power like this didn't just project strength, it created instability. And in a world where nuclear weapons were becoming the ultimate measure of power, instability was the most dangerous factor of all. If you're interested in Cold War stories like this, consider subscribing, because what happened behind the Soviet curtain wasn't just history, it was a system that shaped the balance of power for decades. And in the next part, that system begins to reveal how it truly operated not just as a government, but as a machine designed to eliminate anything that could threaten it, including its own people. What made this system so effective was not just the scale of its control, but how deeply it penetrated everyday life. Under Joseph Stalin, power didn't operate only from the top. It extended into factories, neighborhoods, schools, and even families. The state didn't just watch from a distance. It relied on ordinary people to watch each other. A careless word, a private complaint, even a misunderstood joke could be reported. And once reported, it rarely stayed small. At the center of this structure was the Soviet secret police, an organization that evolved through different names but maintained the same purpose: identify threats, eliminate dissent, and reinforce absolute control. Arrests often happened without warning. Trials, when they occurred at all, were brief and predetermined. Confessions were extracted, not proven. and sentences were swift. For many, that sentence meant disappearance. Across the vast Soviet landscape, a network of forced labor camps expanded rapidly. These camps, later known collectively as the Gulag system, were not just prisons, they were tools of the state. Prisoners were sent to remote regions where survival depended on harsh labor, extreme climates, and minimal resources. Some were there for political reasons, others for minor infractions, many simply because they had been accused. The system didn't need everyone to be guilty. It only needed everyone to be afraid. And fear became a form of control more powerful than any weapon. Entire sectors of society were affected. Military officers, engineers, scientists, people critical to nation strength, were removed during waves of purges. Leadership positions were constantly reshaped, not always based on competence, but on perceived loyalty. This created a system where decisions were often driven by caution rather than innovation. From the outside, it presented a paradox. The Soviet Union appeared powerful, expanding its influence, building its military, positioning itself as a global rival to the United States. But internally, it was operating under conditions that could weaken its own effectiveness. A system that eliminated potential threats also risked eliminating its own capabilities. For American strategists, this contradiction became increasingly important because while the Soviet Union projected strength, it also carried internal vulnerabilities that were not immediately visible. Understanding those vulnerabilities required more than military intelligence. It required insight into how the system functioned and where it might fail under pressure. And that understanding began to shape how the United States approached the Cold War. Instead of direct confrontation, American strategy evolved toward containment, limiting Soviet expansion while allowing internal pressures to build over time. It was a long-term approach, one that relied on patience, intelligence, and the ability to operate across multiple domains, political, economic, and technological. But none of that reduced the danger, because despite its internal weaknesses, the Soviet system was still capable of rapid, decisive action, especially when it perceived a threat. And under a leadership driven by suspicion, even small signals could be interpreted as major risks. That's what made this period so volatile. It wasn't just the existence of power on both sides. It was the uncertainty of how that power might be used. And as the Cold War intensified, that uncertainty would push both nations closer to moments where decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information and consequences that could not be reversed. In the next part, that tension reaches its peak when the internal dynamics of Stalin's system begin to intersect directly with global strategy, creating situations where a single decision could shift the balance between stability and catastrophe. As the Cold War deepened, the consequences of the system began to extend far beyond Soviet borders. What had once been internal control was now shaping global behavior. Under Joseph Stalin, decisions were no longer just about maintaining authority inside the Soviet Union. They were about securing influence across an increasingly divided world. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, not only through military presence, but through political systems modeled on the same principles of control, surveillance, and suppression. Governments were installed, opposition was removed, and across an entire region, a familiar pattern began to emerge. Power was centralized, dissent was dangerous, and uncertainty became permanent. For the United States, this expansion raised a critical concern. It wasn't just about territory, it was about the spread of a system that operated on fear and unpredictability. A system where leadership decisions could be influenced by internal paranoia as much as by external threats. That unpredictability made traditional military planning far more complex, because in a conventional conflict, you could anticipate strategy, assess capability, and calculate risk. But when facing a leadership structure shaped by purges, secrecy, and internal pressure, those calculations became far less reliable. And that's where the real danger began to take form. As nuclear weapons entered the equation, the margin for error disappeared. The United States had developed its atomic capability during World War II, demonstrating a level of technological power that reshaped global strategy overnight. But it didn't take long for the Soviet Union to reach the same threshold. Once both sides possessed nuclear weapons, the nature of conflict changed entirely. Victory was no longer the objective. Survival was. But inside a system like Stalin's, where fear influenced decision-making at every level, the risk of miscalculation was significantly higher. Information could be distorted before it reached leadership. Advisors might hesitate to deliver bad news. Signals from the outside world could be interpreted in the most dangerous way possible. And in a nuclear standoff, interpretation was everything. For American intelligence and military planners, this created one of the most complex strategic challenges of the Cold War. It wasn't enough to understand Soviet capabilities. They had to understand Soviet behavior, not just what the Soviet Union could do, but what it might believe it needed to do. That distinction mattered, because a perceived threat could trigger the same response as a real one. And that meant the United States had to operate with a level of precision and restraint that matched the scale of the risk. Surveillance systems were expanded. Reconnaissance missions became more advanced. Signals intelligence, aerial observation, and eventually space-based systems began to provide a clearer picture of Soviet activity. Each new piece of information reduced uncertainty. And in this environment, reducing uncertainty meant reducing the risk of catastrophe. But even with better intelligence, the tension never disappeared. Because behind every data point, every radar signal, every intercepted message, there was still a system driven by internal pressure, historical fear, and absolute control. A system where one decision, made in isolation, under stress, and without full information, could set events in motion that no one could stop. And as both sides moved deeper into the nuclear age, that possibility became more than theoretical. It became the defining risk of an entire era. In the final part, that risk reaches its conclusion, revealing how the reality behind Stalin's power didn't just shape the Soviet Union. It reshaped the entire balance of the Cold War and forced the United States to build strategies designed not just to win, but to prevent the unthinkable. In the end, the true impact of Joseph Stalin's system wasn't measured only by the lives it controlled or the fear it created. It was measured by how it reshaped the entire logic of global power. Because when a system is built on secrecy, surveillance, and internal repression, its effects don't stay contained. They ripple outward, distorting perception, increasing uncertainty, and forcing adversaries to prepare for the worst possible scenario. For the United States, that meant adapting to a new kind of conflict, one where strength alone wasn't enough. It required precision, intelligence, discipline, and above all, control. American strategy evolved not around immediate confrontation, but around stability. Deterrence replaced direct conflict. Information became as valuable as firepower, and systems were designed not just to respond, but to prevent escalation before it could begin. Early warning networks, strategic command structures, and layered defense systems were built with one goal in mind, ensuring that no decision on either side would be made in total darkness, because darkness was where systems like Stalin's were most dangerous. Over time, the internal pressures within the Soviet model began to reveal their limits. A structure built on fear could maintain control, but it struggled to adapt. Innovation slowed, trust eroded, and the very mechanisms that once secured power began to restrict it. From the outside, the Soviet Union still appeared formidable, but inside, the cost of absolute control was becoming harder to sustain. And that imbalance between outward strength and internal strain became one of the defining factors of the Cold War's long-term trajectory. The United States didn't need to match that system. It needed to understand it. And by understanding it, it could navigate the most dangerous period in modern history without triggering the very outcome both sides feared. That is the paradox at the heart of the Cold War. The greatest weapons ever created were never used, not because the danger wasn't real, but because the system's strategies and decisions surrounding them were carefully managed, even under extreme pressure. And behind that balance was a constant effort to see clearly, think strategically, and act with restraint in a world where a single miscalculation could have ended everything. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and support the channel. Because the Cold War wasn't just a conflict of power. It was a test of control, intelligence, and the ability to prevent the unthinkable.